for example, y equals sine of x. Suppose I wanted to graph that. And so the very first thing that I would do, I would draw my coordinate plane. And then know that, our unit circle starts at 0 and stops at 2 pi. So any regular sine or cosine curve will actually start at 0 and stop at 2 pi. Then we figure out what's halfway of that. That's pi. What's halfway of pi and 0? Pi over 2. And halfway between 1 and 2 is 1.5, or 3 over 2 pi. So 3 pi over 2. And then remember there's a 1 here and a negative 1 there. So our basic sine and cosine graphs will always start at 1 and negative 1. We start at 0. So these are going to be our critical points. So this one here, we know that the graph is going to go up. Again, based on the video, it's going to go through pi, all the way down to negative 1, and then up to 2 pi. So once we have those critical points, those 5 points, then we connect the points. And then we have ourselves a sine curve. Okay, so if this were, again, let's just suppose we just didn't know how to get these, right? So notice that this section here is divided into 4 parts. So the way we can get these points is by taking 1/4 of the period, which is 2 pi in this case. That's where the graph starts and ends, so that's one cycle. And so if I take, for example, 2 pi and I divided it by 4, I get pi over 2, so I get pi over 2. To get from pi over 2 to pi, I would keep adding pi over 2. So this is pi over 2 apart, this is pi over 2 apart, this is pi over 2 apart, this is pi over 2 apart. And again, we got that by taking the period and dividing it by 4 because this section is divided into 4 parts. So we're going to use that information to help us graph the next function. Okay, so let's move on to example 2. I apologize if the video is a little bit shaky, but I am right now recording it, so it's gonna be like that. Okay, so how different is this one from, say, sine of x? Notice that there's a negative 4 here. So that means the amplitude, or how far up or how far down the sine curve goes, it's going to go up 4, down 4. Okay, this little negative is going to tell us that instead of the curve going like this, it's actually going to go down first and then like that. So we're going to be looking for a graph that looks like this. The way we start that again, we create our coordinate plane. We have to figure out what points we actually need to put here. So I'm going to show you how to choose the points, right? So if I know that I'm going to find the period, so how far the cycle lasts, so the formula for that is 2 pi over b, but notice that there's no number in front of x, and so the period is just 2 pi. And so I know that starting at 0, that one cycle of this sine curve is going to go from 0 to 2 pi. So I have my first point at 0. I have to figure out where my second point is, my third point, my fourth point, and my fifth point. So how do I do that? So you take the period, which is 2 pi, and then you divide it by 4, because then you're figuring out how far apart the, I'm going to turn it the other way. So you're trying to figure out how far apart the points are going to be, right? So I know one point's going to be halfway between 0 and 2 pi, another point's going to be halfway here, and another point is going to be halfway there. That's what we're trying to figure out. And the way we do that again is by taking the period, dividing it by 4. Always divide by 4. This is going to give you pi over 2. So this means that I'm going to have to keep adding pi over 2 to get to this point, pi over 2 to get to this point, pi over 2 to get to this point, and pi over 2 to get to that point. So I know first point is 0. Okay, to get to this point, my second point, I know I'm going to have to take 0, and I know I'm going to have to add pi over 2. Well, that's just going to give me half a pi. So now that second point is going to be pi over 2. Okay, if I'm interested in figuring out what this point is, I'm going to have to take this pi over 2, and I'm going to have to add pi over 2 to that. Okay, so I've got 1 plus 1, or 2 over 2, so that's just going to give me pi. So half a pi plus half a pi gives me a whole pi. That's going to be the point in the middle. Then again, if I want to go from this point to the next point, I'm going to have to take that pi and add that pi over 2. So now I'm having 1 and a half. So what is 1 and 1/2? That's the same as 1 1/2 or 3 over 2 pi. So that one's going to be right here. And then basically I know that my ending point is going to be at 2 pi. So if I take 3, 2 pi, and I add pi over 2 to that, I know I'm going to get 2 pi. Okay, so now that I've got all my points, and the reason why I'm showing you this is because we're going to be using the same method for the rest of the problems, and even the other problems that are a little bit more complicated. We now focus on the amplitude. So we know that the graph is going to go up high 4, so I'm going to put 4 instead of 1, and -4, right? But remember how I said this negative means that I'm going to start here, but then go down instead of going up, like this regular sine curve, right? I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to go down through that, down to the -4, through pi, up to 4, stop at where 3 pi over 2 is, and then go all the way down to 2 pi. So that right there is going to be the negative sine curve. And in the next video, I'm going to show you what happens when you add a number in front of x.